Hi, I'm Suzette Bailey, and this is research based reading instruction. All right, so today we're going to dive into the essential components of literacy. Basically, how we turn kids into readers instead of kids who just stare at books and hope for the best. Literacy is a big deal, it affects every subject: math, science, history, and life in general. But here's the thing, reading isn't something kids just magically pick up. If it were, we'd just hand them a book and say, all right, go for it. Unfortunately, that's not how things go. So, in this presentation, I'll break down the science of reading, Scarsborough's reading ropes, and the simple view of reading, and discuss how these frameworks can work their magic on your students' reading skills when applied in the classroom. I'll also walk through the big five components of literacy: phonetic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension, and how they all connect. And finally, I'll share some practical ways to make your classroom a place where reading actually clicks. All right, let's get into it. Let's start with the science of reading, which sounds super scientific, and honestly, it kind of is. But basically, it's a collection of research from psychologists, neurologists, and educational scientists. What it looks like is how we actually learn to read. And one of the biggest takeaways is reading isn't natural. This is not a skill that kids just pick up on their own. Unlike walking, reading has to be taught, and very intentionally. So, this means that we can't just hope students figure it out. We need to be explicit in how we teach them and the skills that we teach them. We need to be doing our best to model best practices and give them a lot of guided support along the way. The science of reading also emphasizes teaching foundational skills like phonics and phonetic awareness while building vocabulary and background knowledge at the same time. And probably the most important part of teaching is early intervention is key. If you see your students starting to struggle, instead of waiting and hoping things improve, then is the time to act right then. Basically, it helps us stop guessing and start teaching reading in a way that actually works. When looking at scientific theories of reading, my favorite is Dr. Hollis Scarborough's reading rope, which is honestly one of the coolest ways to understand reading. As a scout leader, I had my scouts make a rope out of different strands when we were up at scout camp. And at first, those strands were loose and separate and tangled, and quite frankly, a mess. But we had one boy hold a stick with all of the ends of the strands tied to it, and the two other boys each held a stick with half of the strands on each stick. And then we had the boys walk back and stretch the strands out between them. And the two boys that each had bundles of the strands tied to their sticks would twist their bundles, counting as they go in opposite directions. And when they reached 10 or so twists, then they would switch bundles and keep twisting. At first, this was hard for the scouts to remember everything that they needed to do. But as they kept going, it got easier and easier to count and switch and count and switch until by the time that they had twisted to the very end, they were doing it really fast and almost automatically. And they were working together really well. And as they pulled them and twisted them together, all those strands formed a very strong rope. This is exactly how the Scarborough reading rope works. Scarborough reading rope theory works, excuse me. In this framework, there are two bundles of strands that are being woven together, and then both bundles are twisted together to make a final rope. In one bundle, the strands you have to help develop to get word recognition are the strands consisting of phonetic awareness, phonics, and sight recognition. On the other bundle, you have language comprehension, and the strands consist of background knowledge, vocabulary, language structure, verbal reasoning, and literacy knowledge. At the beginning, kids have to think really hard about both sides, but as they practice, these skills start to come together and become automatic. The big takeaway from this is reading isn't just about saying words correctly and fluently, it's about understanding them. If one side of the rope is weak, the whole thing starts to fall apart. So, as teachers, we need to build both sides, not just one, if we want a strong reader. The next scientific theory on reading that I'd like to talk about is the simple view of reading. This it was developed by cognitive scientists Philip Goh and William Turner in 1986. They came up with this equation of how reading works. It says that decoding times language comprehension equals reading comprehension. Or, in simpler terms, you need to be able to read the words and understand them. If a student can sound out every word perfectly but has no idea what they just read, that's a problem. On the flip side, if they understand the language really well but can't decode the words, that's also a problem. That's why in his equation he gives skill knowledge a value of 1 and um, and no skills in that area a value of 0. So you can have competency in 1 but still not full language comprehension. It takes both skills to have full language comprehension. This model is really helpful because it shows us exactly where students might be struggling. If they're reading slowly and stumbling over words, we know to focus on decoding. If they're reading smoothly but can't explain things, we know to focus on comprehension. In this way, we can teach smarter and not harder. Okay, so now let's look at the two main concepts of reading: decoding and understanding. So, decoding is basically the ability to look at the word and figure it out using skills like sounding it out or using letter sound relationships for clues in the word. And this is where phonics and phonetic awareness comes in. Whereas in language comprehension, it's all about the meaning, understanding vocabulary sentences, understanding sentence structure, what the text actually is saying. You really need both, though, if you want your student to have full language comprehension. If a student struggles with decoding, they're using all of their brain power just trying to read the words, so they don't have anything left to understand them. Whereas if a student has a weak vocabulary, they might be able to read fluently, but they don't get what the text means. So it's a balancing act. You can't just focus on one and ignore the other one. They're both important, and both of them have to be strong. That's when reading feels smooth and makes sense. All right, now let's break down the 5 building blocks of literacy. These are the big 5 of reading. We've got phonetic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. Each one plays a different role, but they all work together. Phonetic awareness is about hearing the sounds, where phonics connects those sounds to the letters. Fluency is reading smoothly, and vocabulary is knowing the words and their meaning. And this all comes together with comprehension, where they can understand the overall message. They don't magically develop on their own. They need to be taught clearly and in logical order. If we skip steps or rush through things, students can end up with gaps that make reading really difficult later on. So the goal is to build these skills step by step, like you're climbing a mountain, and we can help our students reach the summit. Let's talk about decoding. There are three parts to decoding. We got phonetic awareness, phonics, and fluency. Phonetic awareness is where it starts. That's the ability to hear and play with sounds in words, like blending and breaking them apart. Then comes phonetics, where students can connect these sounds into letters and actually start reading words. Finally, fluency. This is where reading starts to sound smooth and natural. When students are fluent, they're not stuck decoding every single word. They can actually focus on understanding the meaning of the word. But if these skills are weak, reading becomes frustrating really fast. That's why practice is so important. Basically, we're helping students go from robot reading to reading that actually sounds like a human being. Now, let's talk about words and understanding the text. So, because reading isn't just about saying words, it's about understanding them as well. Vocabulary plays a huge role here. If students don't know the word's meaning, they're not going to be able to read the sentence very easily. They'll struggle. Comprehension is where everything comes together. Our students need to have the skills to think about the text, make connections, ask questions, and figure out a bigger picture. This takes effort and practice. One of the best ways to build these skills is through class and small group discussions, where you can talk about text, explain ideas, and hear each of the students' different perspectives. Repetition is also key when you're teaching vocabulary. Having different times throughout the day when you insert the vocabulary words will help students build and strengthen those neural pathways so that students need for each new word that they learn. When we build up each one of these pillars, vocabulary and comprehension, that's where they can develop and understand text. The goal is to move students from not just reading the words, but actually understanding and thinking about what they read. Okay, let's shift gears for a moment and talk about another key component to helping our students read, and that's the classroom environment. I'd like to look at two different ways that we can support literacy in our classroom environments. First, let's look at creating a physical environment that supports literacy. Our classroom should be clean, well organized, accessible to all students. Incorporating a variety of seating options can be helpful. Also, arranging seating in ways that promote collaboration and include areas for small group interactions. And this can be super helpful because it'll let you have time with the kids where you can target specific needs. Also, create a language rich environment. Second, let's look at how we can create an emotional environment that supports literacy components and literacy instruction. This means having things like read alouds, encouraging supportive discussions, and giving students lots of chances to be heard and hear language. Also, don't underestimate the power of a positive classroom environment. If students feel safe and supported, they're way more likely to take risks and engage in reading. Basically, we want our classrooms to be a place that feels safe and supported, and that will give students confidence to try and take risks. To wrap it up, reading is complicated, but teaching doesn't have to be confusing. The science of reading gives us a roadmap, and models like Reading Rope and Simple View helps us to see how everything fits together. And the five components are the foundation of what we need to help teach the skills clearly and consistently so that our students are more likely to succeed. In the end of the day, our goal is to help our students become confident readers, not just kids who get through a sentence, but kids who actually understand and enjoy what they're reading. Because once this happens, everything else gets easier. And honestly, that's a win for all. Thanks for joining me. Have a wonderful day.